I know you're wanting to listen to this episode of the Comics Alternative, but before we get started, let me just remind you guys that it's the gift-giving season. Now, that may be obvious, but one of the things that's not so obvious is that you can get all of your stuff and help out the podcast by going to comicsalternative.com/Amazon. Click through on our Amazon banner that you find on that page, and whatever you get during that visit to Amazon, the Comics Alternative will get a few cents kickback. So, whether it be Hanukkah, Christmas, Kwanzaa, or Festivus, get your gifts through our Amazon Associate link. It's a smart way to get your books, and you'll be helping out the podcast. And isn't that what the holiday season is all about? Helping our podcast. This is the Comics Alternative, episode 259. Reviews of Bad Mask, Evolution #1, and Dr. Radar #1. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Gwen, and we're two people with PhDs talking about comics.
That's right. And this week we're going to be looking at 3 recent titles. We're going to begin with John Chad's Bad Mask. After that, we're going to look at issue #1 of Evolution, written by James Asmus, Joe Keatinge, Christopher Sebela, Joseph Williamson, with art by Joe Infurnari. And then after that, we're going to wrap up with Dr. Radar, written by Noël Simsolo, with art by Bézian. But before we get to that discussion, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There, you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts can be anywhere from 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some unbelievable specials, even at the tail end of November. Sometimes those specials could be as much as 45% off of the cover price, sometimes 50% off the cover, but often you can find discounts that are even more impressive than that.
That's right, Derek. DCBS has Evolution #3 from Image Comics for $2.39, which is a 40% savings. So that's some of the big money savings you talked about.
Yow.
And you can order the book version of Dr. Radar, which is set to be released on March 14th, 2018. And that's going to list for $11.89, which is a 30% discount.
Those are great prices, and you really can't beat the discounts at Discount Comic Book Service, if for no other reason, because discount is in their name. That's dcbservice.com. You gotta go there. It's imperative for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your comics there, please be sure to send them an email and tell them that Gwen and Derek sent you. So, Gwen, here we are on the other side of Thanksgiving, and last time I talked to you was about a little more than a week ago when we recorded our annual Thanksgiving special. But how was your holiday and the holiday weekend?
I had a really good holiday weekend. Had all of my favorite foods, especially stuffing or dressing, depending upon where in the country you reside. And my dog didn't get sick from eating things he shouldn't have, so that was good as well. So we had a really good weekend, and just getting ready to talk about some comics that I was reading. Yeah.
Now, I have to ask you, did you eat your share of pie on Thanksgiving?
I did. I made my own pumpkin pie. So it was super good. Absolutely.
And I asked because you kept making pie references on our Thanksgiving recording. And in fact, I even used the phrase pass the pie as a subtitle for that episode.
Well, pie is good.
It is.
Yes.
You know what else is good are the three titles that we're going to look at this week, Gwen. How was that for a segue? And we're gonna start off with a rather unusual comic. In fact, I want to put the word comic in quotes. Maybe we should call it a product or a project. And this is by John Chad. It comes out from Boombox, part of Boom Studios. Bad Mask. And this is, I think, going to be released in comic shops on the 29th, so that's the day that this episode goes up. But I think in bookstores on December 5th, so this coming Tuesday. And the reason why this is, a qualified, quote-unquote, comic is Bad Mask is, I guess, the closest thing that it's akin to is Chris Ware's Building Stories from several years ago, which came in a box, and the comic itself, quote-unquote comic, was basically the result of different pieces of texts, right, that came in different mediums. So there were tabloid-sized comics. There was like a fold-out board that, in essence, became part of the comic. There was, in Building Stories, a book that looked like one of the golden book titles from childhood. That was also a part of the story. In other words, there were, I think, something like 13 or 14 different pieces that went into the overall telling that became Building Stories. And we have something similar going on here in Bad Mask, although I don't want to say on a smaller scale, because that would suggest that Ware was doing something much more grandiose than what Chad is doing here. I think they're doing things that are somewhat similar, but in many ways different. So Chad is not really including a variety of media in this Bad Max box that is attempting to do what Chris Ware did. But they're not as many pieces if you don't count the individual trading cards. Right.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have to say that I definitely want to get this because I would like to have the tactile experience. Because we're reviewing it, obviously we were looking at PDFs of the different artifacts rather than being able to hold them. And I think that that's an important part of what they're calling a multimedia experience. And so just to give our listeners a sense for this, there are letters, there's a comic book, trading cards, there's a handbook for an organization that's called Bad Mask, and we'll talk about that in a minute. There are meeting notes from that organization. There's what I liked the best actually was a newspaper and a magazine. The magazine's meant to look like Time magazine
or Newsweek.
Or Newsweek or something like that. And then also an incident report about a particular attack that takes place. And basically this text is a mystery. And you're trying to solve exactly what the nature of Bad Mask is. It's an organization. Is it really, as the name suggests, bad, or is it actually trying to help humanity? And the way that you're asked to look at the organization is from the notes and the perspective of a young woman, a teenager called Gabrielle, who's a new recruit to Bad Mask. And these are some of the documents that she has either been given or has acquired. And young readers are supposed to go through this and solve the mystery of whether Bad Mask really is a bad thing and whether this superhero called Metal Metro, this is really a hard episode to talk about with, I have a slight head cold. It's like Bad Mask, Metal Metro. But anyway, Metal Metro is the superhero, and we're supposed to decide whether he really is a superhero or if there are darker forces at work. And there's a lot of backstory that one has to pick up by reading all of the artifacts. You can't just really go in and take a look at one as a standalone. They really do work together and are intertextual. I would say that, Chris Ware's Building Stories is also, in a way, solving a mystery. You're learning about different characters and what happens to them over time. In a way, that's happening here, but there actually is a specific mystery. And as I was saying before we started recording, that links a lot of what we're doing today, because the other two single issues also are mysteries in a way. So it's kind of, if you really like mysteries, this is the show for you this week.
Yeah, it is. And I'm glad that you drew out, I guess, the common ground that all three titles share for this week's episode, and that is mystery. And I think it's quite appropriate that you and I are discussing these three titles with the common thread being mystery, because I couldn't help but think of the Mystery Mobile and Scooby-Doo, which I know is one of your favorites.
Right. And we also did a show last year, or maybe even longer ago, that was looking at a comic adaptation of an Edgar Allan Poe story. Was it Murders in the Rue Morgue? I can't remember. But at any rate, we both love mystery. So this part is awesome. And it's like I was saying to you earlier, I wish I had the time that I think a 12-year-old would have to sit down and read these artifacts very, very closely, because even the quick, close reading that I did showed a lot of really cute little intertextual moments. And like, just as an example, the playing or the trading cards are the property of a young child whose dad is a character in the series or the collection, and you get a perspective on the dad based on what the kid writes on the little note on the trading card about how he wishes his dad got along better with someone. And so there's even just at the level of like things being signed or little notes on things. So certain things are circled in the newspaper, or certain notes are placed in the handbook that are really a cool touch. And this must have been quite a production to put together.
Right. And, I'm glad that you mentioned the name on the trading cards, because one of the things that does is to, I guess, more overtly throw into question not so much who the audience is, or I think that's part of this. And I'm not talking about the audience for this quote-unquote comic Bad Mask, but I'm talking about the audience for the various components. In other words, who are these collected for? But I think even more so, it asks us to consider focalization, right? Through whose eyes are we seeing this information, or should we get and interpret all of these 7 different components? And so the son of this figure, Nobu, and the kid's name is, Takaro Nobu. Who is this individual, and what is his, I guess, maybe her, I don't know, relationship to the, at least in some ways, the intended audience of this narrative, which, you mentioned as a young woman who goes by the name of Brasso Mask. And in fact, everybody who is a member of the Bad Mask organization, at some point during their time with Bad Mask, once they reach a certain level, then they're assigned a name. And so this young woman's name, Gabrielle, is assigned the name Brasso Mask. And so this is at least who the initial message, which comes in the box, is addressed to when one of the Bad Mask generals, Diode Mask, he includes a letter to Brasco going over the various components, in other words, what we're about to read, and how and why he would want her to look over these various pieces again. Some for the first time, I think, some she's already familiar with. But then when we get to the aforementioned trading cards, and we see that they, at one point, were the property of, I don't know if it's Takaro or Tarako. I mean, it's written out in like a child's handwriting, so it's hard to exactly make out.
I think it's Takako.
Okay, so
or maybe Tararo. I can't tell.
Yeah.
It's really hard to tell.
Yeah, so whether it's Tararo or Takako Nobu, again, who is this individual? I mean, we know he or she, I guess he, because it ends with an O, is the son of Nobu, who is part of the, what is it? The Contra Bad Mask organization. And so what is this kid's relationship with Brasso Mask, if any? And if they're disconnected, then how did Diode Mask get his hands on these cards that had once been owned by Tararo or Takako? And so it does raise a lot of questions, and those questions deal with, I guess, the audience within the narrative as well as the perspective or the focalization through whose eyes are we supposed to interpret all this.
Right, absolutely. And I guess for me, too, one of the things that was I don't know if it was jarring or not, but I guess what I'll say is there are a lot of different styles that are employed in these different artifacts. So, for instance, the trading cards look like standard, almost Pokemon cards. You know, it's in terms of the illustration. The comic book has the feel of a Saturday morning cartoon. It's multicolored, it's bright, it's got those kind of, bright blues and bright pinks. And there's all sorts of like you were talking about pie. Well, one of the things that happens in the comic is that there's this big cake that's disguising something. And so at the end, Metal Metro is saying, you'll get your just dessert. So there's all this kind of goofy kind of Saturday morning puns going on. But then the newspaper account the newspaper really sounds like a newspaper. I mean, the tone is correct. It's in black and white. So I guess if I were going to, I think about this for a minute from the perspective of an educator, I would consider teaching this in a children's comics course or a children's lit course, because we could talk about the different expectations that each format would present, and then what a child reader might get out of sort of comparing those different pieces of information. So there's a lot that you could do with this as a teacher, actually, aside from just sort of enjoying reading it. I don't know. I enjoyed it, Derek. I thought it was I just wish I had more time. I think it's really underscoring for me. I'm thinking back to when I was a kid and I would read each issue of Mad Magazine really carefully, and do all of the, the fold in and really, you could have asked me any question about what was going on in Mad Magazine that week or whatever, and I could tell you. Whereas this just fatigued me in a way, because I have so much going on this point in the semester, and it's like, God, there are so many freaking details. I mean, each of these newspaper stories, it's a 24-page newspaper, right? And like each, you can, if you scan through it and you start reading the articles, you see that there's just so much information. So this would be great for a kid who loves story building or world building, who's really into that kind of sustained, sort of imaginative time in a particular story world. This is perfect. And I think adults might enjoy it too. It has a really retro feel for me, some of these pieces. Or just the whole act of sort of putting together all this different information, sort of like when you're a kid and you read like Encyclopedia Brown or something like that.
Gwen, I'm glad that you mentioned something about world building, because if I look at these various parts of Bad Mask, put them all together, I can't help but think that this is a very intricate, detailed exercise in world building. And in fact, the various contexts that we get from the components, the trading cards, the newspaper, the Central City Journal, the News Press magazine, the incident report, all of that contributes to the kind of things that I know that many creators do when they create these fantastical worlds or science fiction worlds, or as the case here with the superhero genre, the various heroes or villains and their strengths, their weaknesses, their layers, their fortresses of solitude, so to speak, all of that stuff. I mean, all of this taken together is, I think, an elaborate exercise in world building. And I think that would give this project maybe more of an adult feel. I agree with you that younger readers would really resonate with this project, but I think that the complexity and the intricateness is something that adults could very much appreciate as well.
Yeah, and I just as an example of that, while we were sitting here, I was looking at the newspaper again, and one of the articles has the title "Fashion Show and Features Metro-Inspired Looks." And it's out of Los Angeles. Crowds lined up on both sides of Cherry Street waiting to get into what has been called the fashion event of the decade. French designer Luther Ardon has released their looks based on Earth's greatest hope, Metal Metro. It's a brilliant merger of high fashion and adoration, commented fashion scholar Chris Najarian in between stunned tears. This This changes everything, added designer Abby Bergman. Our Dawn has done it. Bravo. And then they show these pictures of these models, and under the first one is a young man walking down the runway, and it says, William Hunter models a simple cotton blouse and rigid leggings constructed of a blend of duropolymer and regular plastic. Amazingly, the leggings hinged identical to Metro's own legs. And so, there's a lot here for adults as well. There's, this is such a interesting take on typical sort of fashion writing and fashion stuff. And so what we call it in the field is dual address. Mm-hmm. And this project really has that feeling. There's lots in it that kids would enjoy, but there's also lots in it that people who love comics would enjoy, because I think, and culture for that matter, because I think there's a lot of cultural commentary that's being placed in here as well. So.
Right. Yeah. And, one of the things that John Chad does really well with Bad Mask is that he does write in these different styles, right? So, your example of that article in the newspaper about fashion, it's worded in such a way that its rhetoric reflects the kind of articles that are actually written about fashion. Same thing with some of the other components of not only the newspaper, but also the I guess the Newsweek analog that we have here, News Press magazine, and some of the other pieces as well. I mean, the trading cards, but I think to a much greater degree, the Bad Mask meeting notes. That section was written as, I guess, a secretary of an organization would take notes, and also include maybe photographs of the proceedings. And same thing with the incident report as well. So, I mean, I think that it's really impressive how Chad can write in these different genres, and write in different, in essence, media, according to the style and rhetoric that has historically informed that media.
Yeah, it reminds me of James Joyce's Ulysses, don't you know? Actually, it really does. I mean, that's the same thing Joyce did, except much more depth and with a lot bigger words. But yeah, I mean, this is really a lot of fun. It was more fun than I thought it was going to be, honestly, and I would like to spend some time with it. I would actually even consider teaching it, because just for the reason you just stated about the sort of different rhetorical styles, because it never hurts to introduce undergraduate students to that concept and to give them a real life example. So, yeah,
one of the things you mentioned earlier is, and I know I alluded to it as well, is making the comparison between Bad Mask and Chris Ware's Building Stories, where I said, it's doing something different. I mean, there is some similar ground here. I think that John Chad's target, though, is a little clearer, it seems to me, and there's also a more coherent narrative, broadly speaking, that he's going after here. I mean, for no other reason, he is limiting his approach primarily as a commentary on, well, I get, if not a commentary on, then within the context of the superhero genre, because that's what we have going on here in terms of Bad Mask. And there is a story, roughly speaking, and an approach we can get out of Bad Mask if we take all of its components together. Whereas with Building Story, it was much more amorphous. And so after you finish Building Story, I mean, at least I would continuously ask myself for months and months afterwards, okay, what do I get from this? What is it all about? And which piece do you read first? I think that is more of a good problem in Building Stories than it is with Bad Mask. With Bad Mask, I don't know. I feel that the components, because there are fewer components, it's easier to determine which to read first. But picking up one over the other really doesn't, I think, determine how you interpret the story, with the exception of the note that we get at the very beginning in the box by Diode Mask, the message to Brasso Mask, because that does get the ball rolling, so to speak.
Although, interestingly, the publisher suggested the order in which we should read them.
Well, you mean the number of the PDFs? Yeah. And again, we should emphasize that, Gwen and I are criticizing, no, but we're talking about this, having read the digital PDF version of this. I'm like you, I definitely want to get my hands on a hard copy of Bad Mask because I think that the tactile experience is part and parcel of what Chad is attempting to get across here. The various media, the feel of the paper, and I'm curious to see how the cards feel compared to the magazine, compared to the newspaper print and all of that. But because we're dealing with a PDF, the PDF came in a folder that we downloaded, and each file was numbered. So 1 was the box, there was the box, and then 1 was the comic, 2 was the trading cards, 3 was the Bad Mask battle book or handbook, so on and so forth. So I guess they're somewhat dictating how we're to interpret that. But on the other hand, maybe they just assign numbers to each of those PDF files haphazardly. I mean, there was no reason or any logic behind assigning one the number 1, another one to number 2, so on and so forth. I mean, I don't know. I mean, but this is a really good example of how getting our hands on a hard copy, literally, would help determine what we discuss in terms of this comic.
Yeah, and just one other really quick thing I want to say, because we were talking about an overarching story, and I think there's a critique in this text in general of the way that adults try to co-opt young people to be helpful to whatever enterprise they have in mind. And nowhere is that more obvious than in this ad that they have. I don't know if you saw this. It's called Make the Call. Talk to a parent, teacher, or police officer. And this whole idea, like the very beginning, Meadow Metro, has its little trusty sidekick, and the whole point of the comic is really to talk about that people didn't trust him, and if only they had trusted them, bad things wouldn't happen. And now this ad, it's very much along those lines of kids. You need to trust the adults who are telling you that Bad Mask is evil, and if you see something suspicious, don't keep it to yourself. Make the call. So there's this whole sort of line of thought running through the comic about how kids are often appealed to by adult authority to sort of be to conform, to accept certain ideas about good and evil. And this is a really cool exercise in getting kids to question that or to call that into question. So I thought that was pretty cool.
Yeah, and it's interesting because that piece that you're alluding to that's in the newspaper, Make the Call, and it says at the top, "For the kids!" ! I couldn't help but think of maybe not only what you mentioned, right? How adults use children and then co-opt their perspective for particular reasons. But I was thinking of something, I guess, perhaps a bit more nefarious, and that is the relatively recent, historically speaking, reality of the Patriot Act, right? Where we are encouraged to report suspicious this or that. So if we see someone who's driving by in a car in a way that does for us subjectively look suspicious, we should make the call. If we do see a package sitting on the street or in a bus terminal by itself, we should make the call. And, how much of that is safety and how much of that is an intended installation of paranoia in a way that will not only, I guess, in a positive way, help to capture certain, terrorist activity or to nip that in the bud, but less positive, a way to instill paranoia in a way to control populations in ways that are similar to way that adults make children maybe a little paranoid or what have you in order to control them.
Right, absolutely. I'm laughing because I remember when I was a very little kid, I heard the phrase "loose lips sink ships," from World War II, and It was really hard for me to understand, and I was trying to visualize it. So when you said that, that came back to mind. But, my mom talked about that growing up during World War II. She was a little kid during World War II, and all of the comic books, all of the movie reels, everything and the radio programs, all of them encouraged these little kids to be on the lookout for Nazis. And my mom recounts this amazing story. She was in Clio, Michigan, which is a suburb of Flint, and Flint was a target. Because of the tank building, the sort of Flint-Detroit corridor was a target. And so they did all of these drills where everyone would have to shut their shades, etc. And during an air raid drill, my mother left her bedroom window shade up by mistake, and she was terrified that Clio was going to get hit by bombs because she had left her window shade up. So in a really serious note, kids do take this stuff seriously. They do notice what's going on in culture. And that was one of the things I liked about Bad Mask, is it brings that up and interrogates that in an interesting way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, Gwen, you want to move on to the second title that we're going to be looking at this week?
Sure.
Yes.
We have...
Oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Okay, yeah, this is Evolution #1, coming out from Image Comics, and this is written by not one, not two, but 4 individuals: James Asmus, Joseph Keatinge, Christopher Sebela, and Joshua Williamson, and the art is by Joe Infurnari. I have to tell you that when I first looked at this issue and saw that it had 4 writers, and not just 4 run-of-the-mill writers, but, these are people with significant name recognition. And I was wondering if we get too many of these highly recognized and competent cooks in the kitchen, what is the concoction we're going to end up with? Is it going to be a hot mess or what? And I have to tell you, I'm pleasantly surprised. After reading this first issue, I'm convinced that 4 strong writing personalities, along with an artist, very capable and very impressive, can work really well together in creating a coherent and compelling story, at least in this first issue.
That includes a number of literal hot messes. I like the way you use that. Yeah, the story, the first issue takes place in 3 different settings. So the story itself is somewhat fragmented. You're getting 3 different backstories. And so at first that can be kind of overwhelming, but they're relatively well developed for the amount of space that actually is given to them. One story is set in Philadelphia, where you have a research scientist who's working in a free clinic and is seeing patients, one of whom a young boy called Ravi, that's the doctor, a young boy called Ruiz Morena, and his mother come in, and he has some interesting symptoms that he's presenting. And then we move quickly to Rome in Italy, where Sister Hannah is trying to help a parishioner who has a meltdown. And then we move to Los Angeles, California, where a young woman named Claire, who works at her parents' company called Cinetropolis, where they basically take in old film reels and try and preserve them or sell them. And her parents apparently have passed, but she and her friend Rochelle are going through the inventory as they prepare to sell the shop. And we see sort of some things that unfold when a customer, Mr. Hurwitz, calls up and is excited, or actually she calls him, and he's excited about a film reel that she has. So you get these 3 really different locations. There's a different mood in all 3 locations, but yet there's a certain cohesiveness in that in each one, the specter of something very serious and sort of plague-like even is going on.
Right, and this plague-like phenomena brings us to this series title, Evolution. And in fact, in that second section that you mentioned that takes place in Rome, when Sister Hannah is trying to calm down the parishioner who is frantic, is speaking only in German, and she can't understand German. He says one word in Latin, and that's progressus. And we don't know exactly if she understands what that means. I mean, my assumption is, being a nun in the Catholic Church, she knows at least basic Latin, and so she understands that progressus is Latin for, among other things, evolution. And so she may get that, but she doesn't necessarily know what that word is referring to. So that's, I think, what the situation is with the other two main characters and settings that you pointed out, right? In Philadelphia, Dr. Hurley, and in Los Angeles, the young woman, Claire. They all are experiencing something with other people that deal with this kind of physical transformation that may be evolutionary in one way or another. And we as readers, just as these three characters, Hurley, Sister Hannah, and Claire, aren't really sure what is going on, what caused it, and why this is happening. Now, that leads me back to the very beginning of this first issue. And I wanted to ask you, Gwen, when you got finished reading the first issue of Evolution, did you remember that at the very beginning, on the first page, we get an example of then before we get the now? Because on this very first page, we have someone who's dressed in, I don't know, I guess some kind
of priest's robe,
priestly occultist robe of some sort. And he says, then it's agreed. We all know our roles. We all know their consequences. We all know what has to happen. We all know our time is now, our time to draw the curtain, our time to end the world. And then we get to the now in Philadelphia, in Rome, and in Los Angeles. I have to tell you, with me, I completely, by the end of this issue, forgot about that first page. And it was only going back and looking at this issue, rereading it in preparation for our discussion today, that I thought, oh, that's right. There was that first page that took place in some kind of, indeterminate past, and it has something to do with this whole evolution transformation thing that's going on, but we don't know what. I'd forgotten about it. Had you?
No, because the picture of the naked woman right in the middle of the page I found really interesting, and sort of like, well, that's interesting. What's that doing there? And no, so for that reason, but also because it's clear that, to me, whatever it is that they did in that room back then, it's manifesting itself now. So I hadn't forgotten it, but I almost wish that, I mean, I guess the fact that one of the stories takes place in a church setting, that actually has some of the same colors. I don't know if you noticed that, but some of the same coloring as that first page. So I did kind of notice that correspondence as well, because each of these stories has a different color scheme. And there's those sort of warm, fiery tones that are in that first panel or that first page, and then they reemerge in the Rome section that follows the experiences of Sister Hannah. But
right,
what
the
also,
brownish red color.
Right, yeah. But what also really interested me was the part at the end where one of the things that we learn is this isn't like some kind of zombie apocalypse that's happening. Instead, some of the people who are showing symptoms are showing that they are developing the ability to deal with the changing environment. And that, to me, was the first time that I really felt like the concept of evolution that was promised in the title was being realized in the text in a way that I could grasp or hold on to. And so this is what kind of separated this for me from just your standard horror comic, is that it's clear that there's going to be a lot of philosophical and scientific discussion going on in this text. And so it actually elevates it a little bit for me. I was pleasantly surprised, too. I really enjoyed it, actually.
Yeah, I enjoyed it as well. Now, I want to follow up on something that you just referred to, and I don't know if we could consider this a spoiler or not, but you mentioned that we learned toward the end of this issue that these physical changes appear to be, we don't know for certain, but they appear to be brought about by environmental changes. So, it's at this point that evolution appears to be some kind of commentary, at least I guess, on climate change in some form or another. Mm-hmm. And so as these characters are changing, we say, you're right, this is not just their typical zombie-ish narrative where people are transforming for the worse. I mean, there's a purpose for this, and it's adaptive in nature. I feel mixed about this revelation toward the end. This is not at the very end, but in the last section of this first issue, we're brought back to Dr. Hurley in Philadelphia. He comes home from the clinic, he goes home, and we find that he has, I don't know if you call it a secret lab inside of his house, but a place where he is doing his research, some experimentation, and he's trying to figure out what these mutations are all about. And the writers are using this scene and Dr. Hurley, I guess, as a form of exposition, right? Because Hurley is in this secret lab that he has in his house, and and I guess he's dictating to a recorder. Subject, 27-year-old Hispanic, diagnosed with asthma. Symptoms have allegedly vanished. Further exploration interpreted by gills. The kid has gills. If their arrival coincides with the erasure of symptoms, this follows my hypothesis. Philadelphia air quality index is up to 190. His body is changing to match the environment, to anticipate future changes. It's an evolution. And on the one hand, I think that type of expositionary writing can inform our reading of what's going on in this first issue, because without the doctor dictating to, I guess, a recorder what he is proposing or hypothesizing here, I'd finish this first issue and still be wondering what's going on. Is this something like another zombie-ish narrative? On the other hand, there's something a little heavy-handed about that scene. It's almost as if the writers feel that they had to kind of force this explanation, this exposition toward the very end of this first issue. And I don't know if the issue would have been successful without this exposition segment or not. Who knows? I think that I could have appreciated this first issue without the doctor speculating and hypothesizing what he's finding in his research. Mm-hmm. And then maybe wait till the second or even third issue in this series to figure out that this is maybe an adaptive response for the better because of the environment. But then again, I don't know how many issues and how long this series is going to run. If it is a predetermined miniseries of 4 or 5 issues, then maybe the writers felt that they did have to force this kind of expositionary segment toward the end of the first issue in order to get the narrative moving. Mm-hmm. What do you think?
Well, I actually would have liked it if the comic had ended at the end of Sister Hannah's story, because one of the things that you see is that whatever it is that is moving across the world, it's contagious. Mm-hmm. And that was really I actually felt a little chill go down my spine when she's sitting there looking at herself in the mirror. And I would have liked to have sort of had that suspense continued. But anyway, it will be interesting. I was looking over at the previews, and I was looking actually at the illustration for the third issue, which is coming out pretty soon, and it looks like some pretty wild stuff is going on. So I think that there's probably room for lots of other revelations. But yeah, it did feel that way a little bit, Derek. But I also I've come off of a semester where I've said the same thing 50 times to my students, hoping that it will sink in once. Sometimes I just think stating the obvious doesn't hurt either. Also, I don't know if you noticed, but there's all of these at the end of the first issue. There's each author writes their sort of take on what being in the project means to them and what the storyline means to them. I don't know if you caught that. It's at the very end. Mm-hmm. And sort of all of them sort of talk a lot about what they think evolution means and what this series means. And so, there's also that factor. I'm not sure that I would read those closely if I were trying to keep a sense of the suspense and maybe wait and get a sense for authorial attention once I finished the actual series. But
yeah, a couple things that you've said just now, I want to respond to. I agree with you that I think that this first issue would have ended quite successfully if the last page was that, let's say, full-page reveal of Sister Hannah pulling down her robe, and we see that she has contracted whatever it is that parishioner had. And you're right, this is chilling. And so the next, what is it, I guess 3 pages, 3, maybe 4 pages, when we're taken back to Dr. Hurley in his home, what I've called the, exposition section. Had we gone without that, I think that this first issue could have stood on its own quite nicely. But again, if this is a limited series, who knows? Maybe they're needing to get things moving a little quicker here. The other thing that I wanted to comment on is the notes at the very end where most, although not all, of the creators contribute a few paragraphs about evolution and what it means to them. I appreciated that, and I liked that part. This takes up 2 pages. The thing that I found curious about it, though, is that we have 4 responses, and I would have expected the 4 responses to come from the 4 writers, Asmus, Keatinge, Sebela, and Williamson. But actually, they're from Asmus, Keatinge, Sebela, and the artist, Joe Infurnari. And so I was asking myself, well, why didn't Joshua Williamson contribute anything? He's one of the 4 writers of this. Shouldn't he at least have a hand before the artist about what evolution may mean for him if he's helping to scribe this narrative? But who knows why he wasn't included in this? Maybe there was a time crunch, or maybe his writing or typing hand was hit and injured. I don't know. But
it's evolving into something else.
That's
Derek.
right. Maybe Joshua Williamson.
He's
is
already
in the process.
Evolved.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. I enjoyed this first issue of Evolution, and this is definitely something that I want to go on and read the remaining issues.
Me too.
Okay, well, that brings us to our third title of the week. And this is coming out from Titan Comics. And in fact, the release date was last Wednesday, November 22nd. And we should also mention that the release date of Evolution #1 was, I think, the 15th of November. But this next issue that we're looking at is Dr. Radar. This is written by Noël Simsolo, and the art is by Bézian. And that is just one word, Bézian. This was originally published in French, and it is being translated by Ivanka Hannenberger. Did I get that correct?
You did. That was good.
Okay, so yeah, and this is an interesting narrative, or at least the first installment of the narrative, Dr. Radar. Titan. By far, this is not the only title of a comic book series that Titan is taking and translating from, let's say, French into English. I like this, and one of the reasons I really enjoyed this first issue of Dr. Radar is that it does have, and not only in terms of the story, but I think definitely in terms of the art, a European flavor. It does have a Franco-Belgian feel to it.
Mm-hmm. And it has a very moody feel to it. The setting is Paris, 1920. It has all the feeling, all the sort of sensibility of an Agatha Christie mystery. Mm-hmm. If you love that kind of thing, which I do, I love mysteries. This has a very cinematic feel to it. In fact, one of the things I was thinking, Derek, as I looked at the first scene, which is set in a Parisian train station, it looks almost like a storyboard for a film. It's the images that, well, there's a lot of motion in these images, people running. We have the Professor Gontran Sinclair, who is heading off to Berlin to share his recent astronomical research with Professor Ludwig Lang, and his wife is imploring him not to go. And it's everything is, she's running after the train, begging him to that she's had this premonition that something bad is going to happen to him. And then you see the train streaming away in the rainy evening with the light of the train engine sort of illuminating the slashes of rain. And it's just like, I almost felt as if I were watching a film.
Right.
So.
And, we were talking about this originally being published in French, and you said it has a cinematic feel. I couldn't help but think of the, I guess, what the French did mid-century in terms of film noir. And, it's one of those examples of the French appreciating something that Americans have done even better than the Americans have appreciated it. And so here is an example, I think, of something, a comics equivalent of a film noir. And not only is the content of the story in the first issue very noirish. I mean, yes, we do have a mystery. We have a de facto detective, someone who is, I guess, not officially a detective. His name is Ferdinand Strauss, but he is a man who is very wealthy, and he's known as a gentleman detective, right? So he can afford going off to different places and solving mysteries and not having to work and all that. Nice work if you can get it, I guess. But the other touches here, and this is from Bézian's art, there's a lot of cigarette smoking and cigarette smoke. There's quite a bit of rain. The initial mystery takes place around and on a train. You also have really interesting, so to speak, camera angles or angles of perspective. And I'm looking at, I don't think we have page numbers here, but in the PDF that we're reviewing from, it's page number 8. So this must be, 6 or 7 of the comic. And this is when Ferdinand Strauss is talking with not the inspector, but
his friend, right?
Yeah, and they're sitting around and they're speculating about these murders that have taken place, and that the thing that they have in common is that these are researcher/scientists who have an interest in astronomy in one form or another. And they're referencing Jules Verne fantasies and whatnot. But if you look on this page, you can see that whenever Ferdinand and his companion are talking, many times the perspective shifts. At times it's from below an individual. At other times it's almost as the camera angle or perspective is above. Sometimes we get 2 individuals in a shot. Sometimes it's more of a close-up than a long shot. And I think that adds not only to the cinematic feel, but also to the noirishness of this narrative. In fact, at times it becomes almost claustrophobic.
There's I was just looking at, I think we're on the same page. The very last panel is where Sinclair is making a point, and his hand is balanced on top of a newspaper, and you're seeing it from above, and there's the shadow of his hand, and it looks really grotesque. I mean, there's these moments of and his arm almost looks as if he's sort of pointing his finger upward, and his arm almost looks as if it's all twisted and deformed, even though in other angles that's not the case. So there's definitely a way in which the line style of this comic and the use of color and the use of figural placement is definitely referencing, I think, film noir. So I bet Andy Wolverton would love this comic.
Right. Now, you mean Strauss's hand, right? Because...
yes, Strauss's hand. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Didn't mean to.
Yeah. Actually, that's the page before the one I was looking at, but I see what you're talking about. Right. So even that is kind of visually making something a little more grotesque, which definitely feeds in the noir style.
Yeah, and you're right on that last panel when he says mortal danger, and he's saying it from behind, and now his coat looks a different color. But notice the face of the woman whom he's walking past, and the look, or it's just like the look in her eyes. It's like terror, So it's I really loved the use of color and line style in this comic. It was actually my really favorite comic that we read.
I have to agree. Of the three titles that we're discussing this week, and I enjoyed and appreciate all three,
right.
But Dr. Radar is the one that really resonates the most with me, which is interesting because when we decided on what we were going to discuss this week, sometimes with Titan comics, they're hit or miss with me. Sometimes I really enjoy them, and sometimes I think, oh, it's okay, but it's not my favorite, but it's worth discussing. So I didn't know what to expect from Dr. Radar, but I was very pleasantly surprised at how much I loved this first issue. Now, you mentioned something about Bézian's use of color. I really appreciated that, how he shifts color in a transitional way. In the example that you referenced with Strauss and his companion are heading off in a crowd, and this is when he says at the end of this page, mortal danger. And you're right, whereas the context had been illustrated in blue, in this last panel, as Strauss and his companion are heading off into a crowd, we can see the back of their coats and hats. It looks green. And so there is a shift in color in that last panel before we switch scenes on the next page, which is in a completely different color, a kind of yellowish tan. And I really do enjoy the way that Bézian switches out colors, sometimes going from one page to the next, sometimes transitioning from one panel to the next, if there especially is a scene shift. And they are visual indications that things are about to change. So if you look, another example of this is a couple of pages down from where you just referenced, and you get Ferdinand Strauss talking with, I guess this is St. Clair's wife, and this is in that kind of tannish yellow color, and then the perspective pulls outside of that house to show a primarily blue tone in the art, yet with that yellowish tan inside the window that we can see from outside, which transitions us into another scene, which is a mix of this blue and yellow, eventually settling into orange.
Right, and orange is in the sort of dive bar. So you move from sort of the upper crust interior at the villa to the dive bar, and the color variation really helps set the mood for all of those places.
Exactly,
so, yeah.
And what we do have on our hands here in this first issue of Dr. Radar, and this is, I don't know how many pages, but this is kind of like Evolution, a substantive #1 issue. In other words, we have more than just 22 or 23 pages. We have 30-some pages in each of these issues. But we have a very good setup in this first issue of Dr. Radar, right? We learn about Ferdinand Strauss and what he's after and how he's able to do what he does. In other words, being a gentleman detective. We learn a little bit about the various scientists or researchers who are murdered. Emile Lenoir, Gautran St. Clair, Bruno Vaillant, and Aristide Vernon. But also, we are introduced to, I guess you could call him the big bad of this series, and that is the titular character, Dr. Radar. But Dr. Radar is not initially introduced by this name. We don't want to give any, I won't say who he's introduced as, because that becomes part of the mystery. But this is someone who apparently is adept at costumes and disguise.
And nationalities.
And nationality, yeah. And so at the very end of this book, and this is definitely not a spoiler, when the last scene ends at a circus, right, the Marcus Circus, that really comes as no surprise, because if a circus is a place for fantastical wonderment and out-of-the-ordinary displays, that definitely is what Dr. Radar is all about.
Right, and there's also another character who's introduced, and that's the police commissioner who is in competition in a way with the detective, right? So this is
Commissioner
a classic,
Bagnol.
right? Yeah, this is a classic technique of sort of the Christie mystery, especially. So I cannot wait to read the rest of this, and I may wait till it comes out in a collection in March and just get the whole thing together, because I bet that will have the very glossy pages. Mm-hmm. That's one of the problems with reading these in PDF is I would love to see this in actual print, but I have to laugh because he's not just a gentleman detective, but Ferdinand Strauss is also a flying ace. And one of the things that I really enjoyed about this comic was the discussion that characters are having in the 1920s about progress, mm-hmm. and about things that once were just contained in fantasies are now coming to truth and to fruition. So the idea of the automobile, right, that they talked about, well, would your father have ever believed that there'd be such a thing as an automobile, is what one character says to another. Mm-hmm. And, part of the mystery that's going to be unraveled here is the mystery of spaceflight. Mm-hmm. So, there's a very contemporary pull in this text as well. And so I don't know, I found the story space in this text to be beautifully evoked. That it happens slowly. Over time, you start to really feel as if you're in these settings, and I can't wait to read the entire thing. And of course, I could technically buy the entire thing in French and read it.
That's right, you could.
But maybe I might actually just go ahead and ask my friend in Belgium to get it for me, because I really can't wait to read it. It looks like so much fun.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned that conversation on modernity, and this takes place fairly early on. And in fact, it's a scene that we referenced a little while ago. This is when Ferdinand Strauss is talking with his companion about the Jules Verne fantasies. And, Strauss makes the comment, who would have thought that many of the things that Jules Verne's speculated on as something that could not exist, right? These are fantastical. Many of them now exist, like automobiles and telephones and what have you. So why shouldn't spaceflight be a reality in several years? Which, we know it does become, because we're not conspiracists, right? We don't believe that the moon landing in 1969 was staged.
That's right. It was real. I sat there and watched it myself on television, so I know it was real.
Now we were talking about some of the major characters in this first issue, and I can't believe we have forgotten to mention one of my favorites, and this is the one clear historical figure that has a part in this narrative, and that is Jules Passin.
His friend, the artist, yeah.
Yes, the famous painter. And, to my knowledge, this is the second time within the past 2 years that Passin has been, if nothing else, a character, if not the subject of a comic of some sort.
Really? What was the other one, Derek?
Johann Sfar did a biography of Passin that came out through Uncivilized. And in fact, our friend Edward Govan translated it. But that was a biography, and so, of course, he was the principal character. Here, Passin has a much more minor role, but we meet him in this bar, and Strauss meets him in the bar. And so he and Strauss, for a while at least, go on the investigations together.
Huh, cool.
Mm-hmm. So I thought that was an interesting touch. And in fact, when I saw that this was the actual real-life Passin that's being referenced here, I had to look up some of these other names, especially Ferdinand Strauss, to see if maybe this has some historical link as well that I was just, uninformed about. But it doesn't, as far as I can tell.
It turns out he was friends with Wyndham Lewis, who's a British artist who I've studied a lot. Interesting. Mm-hmm. You learn something new every day on the Comics Alternative, Derek.
That's right. And that's why we're here. That's why, we're two people with PhDs talking about comics. We're educators.
We are.
That's right. But yeah, I of the three titles we've looked at, all of which I enjoyed, Dr. Radar is at the top of my list here.
Right. And by March, you could have this whole beautiful collection. So that's exciting.
A lot of fun, Gwen. On this week's episode, we started off with an interesting narrative from John Chad, Bad Mask, and that's coming out from Boombox. After that, we looked at James Asmus, Joe Keatinge, Christopher Sebela, Joshua Williamson, and Joe Infurnari's Evolution&nbsp, coming out from Image. And then we wrapped up with, I think, our favorite of the week, Dr. Radar&nbsp from Noël, Simsolo, and Bézian, a Titans comic release.
Absolutely. I can't wait to read the sequels to all of these. Especially Evolution's really interesting. I think that I might get that in the trades, but I think I'm going to wait for the collection of the English language collection of Dr. Radar. But
right. And, who knows? You and I were speculating right before we turned the mics on that, for all we know, there may be a sequel to Bad Mask.
Yeah, I know. That would be exciting, too.
Yeah, it'd be possible. So, you can find great comics like the ones that Gwen and I discussed this week at the website of our sponsor, which is Discount Comic Book Service. In fact, as Gwen mentioned at the top of this week's show, you can find issues, either individual or even trade collections, of some of the titles we discussed this week at great discounts right now if you go to dcbservice.com. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you're going to be reading. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message online via SpeakPipe. Or you can contact us the old-fashioned way by picking up the phone and dialing 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
Or you can contact us by email at 2TWOguys@comicsalternative.com, or you can get in touch with us individually. I'm Gwen at comicsalternative.com. Derek, how can people reach you?
At Derek at comicsalternative.com. You can find us all over social media, such as on Twitter, Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, Pinterest, YouTube, and Slack. You can subscribe to the podcast through Apple Podcast. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, on Spotify, on iHeartRadio, and on Google Play Music. But you can find every single one of our podcast episodes, as well as the reviews and comics-related commentary that we post on our blog, simply by going to our website, comicsalternative.com.
Well, till next time, Derek, it's been great.
Yes, we'll be back next week. And in fact, next week is going to be our December preview show. So make sure you come back for that. Until then, I'm Derek.
I'm Gwen.
Thanks for listening.